Have you ever taken a photograph which looks so perfect in the moment, but looking back on the photos, they end up being blurry? Well, don't worry, because this happens to everyone, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing you 7 key tips that you can use to help get razor sharp photos in any situation. Now, the first tip most people are told when they're trying to get sharp photographs is to make sure that you're using a fast shutter speed. But what do we mean by this, and are there any rules that we can follow to help guide us? Well, fortunately, yes, there is. When shooting stationary subjects, I'd recommend using a shutter speed of at least 1 over the focal length of the lens. This means that if you're using a 300mm lens, you want to use a shutter speed of at least 1 over 300, or if you're using a larger lens like a 600mm lens, then you want to use a focal length of at least 1 over 600. This is because when we're shooting a stationary subject, the only motion that we're trying to remove is that of ourselves, which can be a problem even for people with very steady hands. But don't worry, later on in the video I'm going to show you a couple of techniques that you can use to stabilize yourself. Now, for large moving subjects like deer or big birds like herons, I would use a shutter speed of at least 1 over 1000. Whereas for smaller mammals like squirrels or smaller birds like blue tits, I would use a much faster shutter speed like 1 over 2000. This is because their motion is generally far more erratic and less predictable. Now, these are very good starting points, but later on in the video I'm going to show you how you can adjust these settings and still get sharp shots. Now, my second tip would be to keep your ISO as low as possible. This is because having a high ISO will introduce noise and ultimately will reduce the sharpness of our photograph. Now, fortunately, most modern cameras will handle noise quite well, but in terms of recommendation, it's all dependent on your sensor size. If you're using an APS-C camera, such as the Sony a6000 series, or perhaps the Canon R7 or the R50 or even the R100, I would recommend setting your ISO between 100 and 1600. Whereas if you're using a full frame camera like the Sony a7 series or the Canon R5 or the R6, then you can push your ISO slightly higher, and I'd recommend setting your ISO anywhere between 100 and 12,800. And I would say generally that a fast shutter speed should always take priority over a high ISO. This is because it's easier to fix a noisy photo in post than it is to fix a blurry one. And in fact, if you do have to denoise, then the results that you get from Lightroom denoise these days are generally really fantastic. Whereas if we're comparing this to software that claims to fix blurry photos, such as some of the Topaz software, I'm still not fully sold on them yet. And another tip to tie this back to shutter speed is that you should start with a high shutter speed to get a shot in the bank, and then gradually bring that shutter speed down, allowing you to get a cleaner photo bit by bit. This means that if any of these cleaner photos end up being blurry, it doesn't really matter because you've already got your photo in the bag. Now, if we're talking about getting the most out of our gear, then there's one interesting setting that we should talk about, which is aperture. Now, the reason that aperture is interesting is that unlike ISO and in some situations shutter speed, aperture will control not only the sharpness of our photograph, but also the creative look of it. This is because of all the settings that we've discussed so far, aperture is the only one that will affect the depth of field. Now, if we take a look at these two photographs, you'll see the one which was taken with the lower aperture has a smaller depth of field, and as such the background is far more blurry. But what about sharpness? This is where it becomes interesting, because unlike ISO, there is a non-linear relationship between how sharp your photograph is and the aperture. Generally, most lenses from the consumer level all the way up to the very expensive prime lenses are not at their sharpest when they're wide open. And in fact, most lenses will become their sharpest when you step them down by about 1 step. But as we push the aperture even higher, they actually start to become soft again. This is because you start to get the effects of diffraction. Now, for most zoom lenses like my 150 to 600, this means that it's sharpest at about f8. As such, if you're looking for the sharpest possible photograph, I'd recommend stopping down by at least 1 stop. For me personally, I like the blurry background, but I also like the additional bit of light that I get from leaving my lens wide open, which means I can push my shutter speed that little bit higher, and I'll generally end up with a sharper shot that way instead. Now, when it comes to taking a sharp shot, we want to make sure that we absolutely nailed our focus. To do this, we want to be certain that we're using the correct focus mode. So should you just set your camera to the widest autofocus setting and let it do the work? Well, generally this is not a great idea, because although the autofocus is really good at tracking things, it's generally not the best at identifying which subject you want to focus on. So under most situations, I recommend using zone autofocus as opposed to the widest setting. This is because it's going to increase the chance of the camera selecting the right subject, but it's also going to allow us to plan our compositions in advance. For example, with this photograph of a puffin that I took down in Skomer Island, I wanted the bird to be looking into the frame. In order to do this, I moved my focus area over to the left of the frame, and simply waited for the bird to look out over the sea and took my photograph from there. And there's another scenario that I'd like to take you through now, which is when you're trying to take a photograph of a subject with a very busy background, such as trying to take a photograph of a little bird in between a whole bunch of branches. Fortunately, there's an easy solution for this, and that is to use spot focus. Now, spot focus is an even more targeted focus area than zone autofocus, and it will allow you to guide your camera into picking up your subject between all the messy branches. Now, in order to pull this off successfully, you need to make sure that you're very steady and give your camera the best chance of picking up that subject. This is something we're going to talk a little bit more about later in the video. The final thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of focus modes is to make sure that you're in AFC mode. This essentially means that when you have your shutter speed half pressed down, your autofocus is going to be continually working and tracking your subject. This is better than the alternative, which is AFS mode, which when you press it down, it will lock onto your subject, but if your subject moves, it's not going to track it. So one issue that we talked about is stabilisation. This can be an issue when you're tracking a subject across the sky, or if you're waiting for an action to happen. And I'm sure we've all had moments where we're waiting for a bird to take off, lowered our camera down only for that bird to fly away, and we've missed that moment. So how can we fix this? Well, the best option is to look for something to support ourselves. This will not only give us a chance to rest, but it's also going to help if, like me, that you have a tremor. And this is going to increase the likelihood of us getting sharp shots even at lower shutter speeds. So what sort of things could we use? Well, in the past I've used everything from tripods to bean bags to branches to friends' shoulders. But what if you don't have a tripod and want to shoot handheld? Well, fortunately most cameras will have in-camera stabilisation, but also some lenses will as well. And this is going to help to stabilise your lens and get a sharper shot at lower shutter speeds. Now, one thing to note when you are using stabilised equipment is that when you're using things like tripods, to turn the stabilisation off, as sometimes this can actually lead to a blurrier shot as it tries to stabilise essentially nothing. Now, another tip that you might find useful is to shoot at a high frame rate. This means the number of photographs that you're taking at any 1 second. But I'd also like to add a little bit of finesse to this tip. You see, when I'm shooting, I like to shoot in small bursts. And let me explain why. You see, if I'm shooting a bird in flight with a single shot, let's say I have a 50% chance of shooting that bird. Whereas if I'm shooting with a high frame rate, I have 50% chance of each shot being sharp. As such, I've got many more opportunities for a sharp photograph. And the other benefit to this is I'm going to get lots of different wing positions to choose from. Now, the reason that I like to shoot in small bursts is that even though most cameras have got a very large buffer, I don't want to fill that buffer. If you do end up filling up that buffer, then what's going to happen is that your frame rate is going to start to reduce. And inevitably, this is when the best action is going to occur and you're not going to be able to make full use of that high frame rate. And another reason I like to shoot in small bursts is it means that I can be more reactive to the action. For example, if a bird was to change direction at the last minute, then I can crank up my shutter speed and react to that. Or if I want to change my composition at all, then I can zoom in and zoom out and react accordingly. Now, up to this point, we've spoken about a lot of the technical changes that you can make to make your photograph sharper, but are there any non-technical aspects that you can implement? Well, fortunately, yes, and it's all to do with good lighting. You see, good lighting is going to introduce additional contrast into our images and make them look sharper. And this is why photographs taken on sunny days are generally going to look sharper than ones taken on cloudy days. Now, the best time of day is going to be the morning or the evening in what's known as the golden hour. This is because it's going to provide us with the additional contrast to make our photographs look even sharper. And of course, the additional bonus to shooting at this time of day is that you get wonderful sunrises and beautiful sunsets. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit the like button down below. It lets me know which videos you guys are really getting the most out of. And all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you at the next one.